guys, I'm Kathy Doyle, and I am a master gardener from the class of 2019. I applied to become a part of that class after reading the works by University of Delaware professor Dr. Doug Tallamy, who wrote a wonderful book called Bringing Nature Home. And I'll put that in the chat because I forgot to add it to the resources, and I didn't actually use it as part of my research this time. But he really inspired me. He's inspired a lot of people to increase our use of native plants. I'm also working on an ecological gardening certificate up at Mount Cuba, which is just sort of the paradise of native plants. All right, Debbie, next.
Hi, and welcome everybody. Kathy and I are co-presenting for you today. So we'll be alternating talking about 12 different invasive plant species and native plants you could think about replacing the invasives with. We'll alternate, and we have a dozen to talk about today. I will do 6 and Kathy will do 6 pairs. So if you've come to our workshops, you probably know me. I'm Debbie Nicole. I'm the chairperson of the Kent County Master Gardeners Workshop Committee. And I am primarily an organic vegetable gardener, but it's always great to explore new knowledge and learn new things. So I have been delving into native plants within the last year or so, and am learning a lot. So we're going to start.
Okay, so native plants, we need to start with some definitions. It is a plant, I know you can all read, but I'm going to read it to you anyway. A plant species that is indigenous to North America or to a particular region within North America, known to have occurred there historically. Now, obviously, a native plant can be a native plant in China or a native plant in Africa. The native plants we're going to be talking about are native to our continent. So they've been part of the balance of nature that's developed over hundreds or thousands of years in an ecosystem. People like to debate, well, is it really native? What if it's been here for 100 years? Nope, not native. It's really got to have been here a much longer time than that. Debbie?
Okay. So we are going through these definitions to try to clear things up because sometimes it can get a little fuzzy. So what is a non-native plant? Non-native plants have been introduced, usually by humans, from other parts of the world, either intentionally or unintentionally. Non-native plants are only considered invasive or bad if they are harmful to the environment, the economy, or human health. As long as a non-native species doesn't have invasive characteristics, it can add value to the landscape. Some non-native flowering plants will bloom longer into the season and provide food for some of the pollinators when the natives are no longer blooming. So that's a good thing that they can do. In the picture here, you will see crepe myrtle. It's an ornamental. It's native to Southeast Asia, India, Northern Australia, and other parts of Oceania. But it's been naturalized in other parts of the world, including here, and it's been kind of adopted into our landscape. It is not invasive, but it is non-native.
So an invasive plant, these are the bad guys. It's a plant, it's an alien plant. It is capable of rapid spread into relatively undisturbed natural communities. And once it's established, it causes adverse ecological impacts within the invaded community. It grows quickly, and so essentially it spreads to the point of disrupting other plant communities. And as Debbie pointed out, not all non-natives are invasive. It's a small number, but they are devastating. Debbie?
And another definition that can be a little confusing to people is an aggressive plant. Native plants can be aggressive as well as non-natives, but when they're non-natives, we tend to call them invasive. Native plants can be aggressive if they take over the landscape or if they cause a problem. For example, ragweed, it's a native plant, but we all encourage its removal because its pollen is an allergen that's harmful to many humans. Another example that you might be familiar with of a native plant that's undesirable is poison ivy. Poison ivy is a native plant in this area, but who wants to grow poison ivy in their garden? I don't think I do. So these can be aggressive because they can take over and cause harm to humans or to the environment. For example, also in this picture is Canada goldenrod. It's a beautiful plant, attracts a lot of pollinators. It's awesome to have, but it can take over to the point where it's almost becoming a monoculture. So that's just a term. Being aggressive doesn't necessarily mean a really bad thing unless it's causing harm in some way.
So what's so bad about invasive plants? Well, they outcompete native plants. They create dense single species areas that alter the habitat, and they provide no food for native insects or birds. And for me, that final bullet is the most concerning because bird species and insects have declined dramatically in the last 60 years, kind of coinciding with baby boomers coming of age. And baby boomers' demand for housing. So we have housing developments, shopping malls, highways, all of which have replaced farm fields and forests. And so fewer natural areas has caused part of this decline. Plus, America's love affair with the big green lush lawn has had a pretty dramatic impact with the use of chemicals that we use to keep them lush and green. That's added to the decline of native insects and birds. And the main insect that thrives in our lawns is the Japanese beetle, which isn't really a helpful insect. Many, not all, as Debbie pointed out, but many non-native trees, shrubs, and flowers provide little to no nourishment for our insects and birds. So they might be pretty, that's about it. But each native plant that you plant does help provide nourishment along with other benefits, some of which Debbie's going to mention in the next slide.
Right. So what is so great about native plants? What is all the rave going on right now these days that you hear about native plants? As you can see from the graphic, native plants tend to have deeper roots and they're better at surviving drought conditions. And as Kathy, who's an expert on this, told me the other day, the longer roots also help to filter out the bad things from the water. And so that's a good thing that they can do. They also support native wildlife. Many insect species will only consume the pollen of plants native to their area. And some birds prefer fruit from native plants. Native plants are better adapted to soils, moisture, and weather in their native area than the exotic plants that evolved in other parts of the world. Also, native plants are unlikely to escape and become invasive or destroy natural habitat. And as far as lawns go, putting native plants in your lawn help preserve the biodiversity in the landscape, which is also a great, one of the things that benefits the remediation of climate change.
Okay, so I'm going to be honest, I still have a little trouble with all of the different levels of names that go into the botanical name. But what I can tell you is that it's very useful to know the botanical name because it's precise. It's the same name no matter where you come from on the planet. And it also makes it easier to find in a gardening catalog. There is only one botanical name for any particular plant. We all tend to use common names. And I'm going to admit that I'll be using the common name mostly during this presentation, but we will show you the botanical names. Common names can be created by anybody. And you might have the same common name or a close common name to refer to different plants. For example, butterfly weed versus butterfly bush. Very different plants. Butterfly bush is like junk food for the butterflies. Butterfly weed is critical for the butterflies. So if you are kind of confused, you can't remember, you want to know what the botanical name is of the butterfly weed. Or maybe you're thinking about Pachysandra. But Pachysandra by itself if you're looking for the native Pachysandra, you want to make sure that you're using the botanical name, Pachysandra procumbens. You might be thinking, oh, I like goldenrods. I want to add them to my garden. How many can there really be? Well, there's about 120 of them. So if you know the botanical name, you'll know which one you want, Solidago speciosa or Solidago rugosa. And you can look these up, you can find them. It's not that hard. Pronunciation, that's kind of another story. But genus, and you're going to see this on the slides that Debbie has created. She's created all these fabulous slides. The genus is it's kind of like the trunk of the tree. It's sort of the main family roots, and it's always capitalized. The species is never capitalized. Species often gives you a hint, like macro means big on this slide. So species will give you some little hint about something about the plant usually. And phylum, if the word phylum or macrophylum means leaf. Sometimes it might be a name of a place, like it might end with Virginiana. If it ends with like Virginiana or Canadensis, Marylandica, you're going to know that it's a relatively or very native plant. We do consider Canada to be part of our continent, so it is usually plants from there can work as native plants down all the way down here. And just variety is usually it's a grouping within a species. So like the heirloom variety of tomatoes. Cultivar, we didn't put that on the slide, but a lot of times you'll see a cultivar, and it's a cultivated variety that's usually created by selective breeding that humans have done. Hybrids are a genetic cross between two different species. And then when you see a SP, that means it's singular, and SPP is plural. So it might be identifying one type of species or several species. Okay.
And the reason we wanted to put this in here, as you'll see on some of the slides, a lot of times when we recommend a replacement for an invasive, if possible, we try to find a native in the same genus. So you'll see a lot of the slides where we're comparing the invasive with the native, that we can actually find some that are in the same genus where one is invasive and one is native. So if you really attach to a plant and you like the way it looks, this might be a good way to find something that's similar if you want to replace that invasive plant. Okay, I wanted to mention quickly some plant ID apps, because in order to know if something is invasive or native, you kind of need to know what it is. If you have a mystery plant and you're not sure what it is, one of the options is to download a plant app if you have a plant ID app if you have a smartphone. I use these all the time. I personally have all three of those first free apps. My husband has Picture This. I haven't had any experience with the other two, Flower Checker or Garden Compass, but I have seen good reviews on those. Let me just say something really quickly about the three that I have used. My favorite is the number one up there, which is Seek by iNaturalist. And one of the things I love about it is that it also can be used to identify insects and even animals. I took a snap of my husband and it said he was a human. So it even works for that. It's pretty good. Of course, the ones that have been around the longest have larger databases. They have more information stored and they are better at identifying it. If I use Seek and it can't identify something, a lot of times it'll just tell me something is a dicot, which is like the whole going all the way back to the family, even farther than the genus, and it can't identify it. Then I'll try one of the other ones. I'll try Plant Snap. I've used that. That was the first one I bought or I downloaded. And Plant Net I recently downloaded, and it's pretty cool too. You can also share, if you take pictures, you can share them with other people and they can help identify things. The thing about Seek is that I really like too is you can basically scan a picture. You don't have to take a picture of it. You can just use your phone to scan it like you would scan a QCR code when you're shopping. And it will, once it detects what it is, then it'll take a picture itself. So I kind of like that feature. So that's one thing you can think about using. Of course, I always recommend free if possible. And but I can't recommend any particular one. We're not allowed to do that, but I just can mention some that are available to you. And of course, if you live in Kent County and you have something and you just can't figure it out, run by the Pardee Center over on Bay Road and drop off a sample there, and it can be sent to an expert on identification, and you fill out a form and they will get back to you with the plant ID. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and go first with maple trees. The one on the left that you see here is the invasive Norway maple. This tree came from Eurasia. It's native in a band running from Norway, hence its name, to Iran. It actually was brought here to Philadelphia in 1756 by a botanist, John Bartram, and he promoted it here, and it was planted heavily as a street tree in the mid 1900s. How can you tell it from another kind of maple tree? Well, it has a grayish brown bark, very large dark green leaves that are wider than they are long and have 5 to 7 lobes with pointed teeth. So if you see a maple tree that has really leaves that look unusually large, it's likely it's a Norway maple. The greenish, it has greenish yellow flowers, and the seeds, you know, those little helicopters that maples put out, on a Norway maple, they're almost 180 degrees in a line. So they're spread out wider than you would see on like a red maple. And they also have a milky leaf sap. The natives will have a clear leaf sap. It's harmful because it outcompetes our native maples. The seedlings from those little helicopters will invade forests, and the mature trees have a really deep shade, which is why they were originally planted as a street tree. But it reduces the light available to the understory plants in the forest, and it will shade them out. So how to get rid of it? You're going to hear this over and over again because a lot of the ways of getting rid of things are the same. If it's a little seedling, just pull it out and dispose of it. If they're a little bit bigger, you can dig them up. Make sure you dig up the roots. If it's a large tree, which a lot of them are, they'll be really large trees, you can get it cut down and grind the stump. Or another method is to girdle the tree. So go about 3 feet from the ground and cut away the bark in the circumference of the tree. And this also will weaken and possibly kill that tree. If you choose to use chemicals, after you cut down the tree, you can apply a chemical called triclopyr, and you can put it on the cut stems, the trunk, and that will kill the tree. If you do have a Norway maple and you would like to replace it with another kind of maple, some native replacements that are great, my favorite is the red maple. Also a silver maple, you got to be careful with them because they can also spread, but they're a nice tree. Sugar maples are recommended, but with climate change, sugar maples are starting to have a pretty hard time. They don't like it, a lot of heat. So even at my house in Canada, some of the sugar maples are struggling and dying, and they're moving even farther north. So I don't think that with what's going on in the world right now, I would highly recommend planting a sugar maple, but of course you can try. A black maple is actually a subspecies of a sugar maple, and they will hybridize and grow in this area.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about the tree of heaven and the staghorn sumac. They are not from the same genus, but they do look very similar. So, I do want to just point out before we get too much further that if you are thinking, oh, I want to plant that plant, you will want to check on what kind of growing conditions are going to best suit them. You know, should the soil be acidic? How moist, how much sun. We're not really going to go into those kinds of details in this presentation, but that information is easy to find, and I think you'll be able to find it if you use any of the resources that we recommend at the end. So anyway, the tree of heaven, bad tree. It came here in the late 1700s from China. It became popular in urban landscaping. You're going to hear us say that a few times. One of the things that is a big problem with the tree of heaven, recently discovered, is it's the preferred host of the spotted lanternfly, which is a pretty bad insect that's doing a number on vineyards and so forth. The tree of heaven releases chemicals into the soil, which makes it so that other plants cannot grow. It grows very rapidly, and it can grow to as tall as 80 feet. And then that, like we're going to say about some of these, it reduces the light available to any of the plants trying to grow beneath it. And female trees produce huge numbers of wind-borne seeds. The sumac, which is the native tree, it grows to about 30 feet tall, and it provides important winter food for many species of birds, provides pollen and nectar in the flowers, nesting sites for bees and other insects. If you're squeamish about the idea of insects, just imagine a world without birds. Change your opinion about insects. Some of the ways to tell the difference, the sap in the tree of heaven is clear. The sap in the sumac is kind of milky and sticky. The young stems on the tree of heaven have no hair, whereas the sumac is covered in dense hairs on young stems. For the leaves on the tree of heaven, the underside is green or light green. If you crushed the leaves or the stems, they emit an unpleasant odor. And the leaves are smooth all the way around except just at the base, whereas the leaves on the sumac are toothed all along the edges. I think that's the easiest way to tell the difference. And if you turn if you looked under the leaf is white. The bark on the tree of heaven is gray, and it's got these vertical lines on the older trees, whereas on the sumac, the lines are horizontal. The fruit on the tree of heaven, you would see they show up in these large clusters of sort of those helicopter wings. The sumac fruit is these clusters of red hairy fruits that you can kind of see in that picture. And getting rid of the tree of heaven, the least invasive thing to do is to inspect your property, pull out, dig out, cut out any of the small trees. You can also do repeated mowing over them before they flower, and that will weaken them over time so they'll die out. And then the last resort, it should always be your last resort, is to cut them down as close to the ground, and then you apply some glyphosate, which is the magical poison in Roundup, but we don't recommend brand names, and you can get glyphosate in products that aren't Roundup. Anyway, you take one of those little paint brushes, and the foam paint brushes, and you just paint that stump as quickly as you can. You don't want more than 5 minutes to go by after you've cut that tree down to the ground. And you only want to do that during growing season, which is mid to late summer. Because if you do it any other time, you're not doing anything. You're just injuring anything around it. Okay, Debbie.
Okay, I want to talk about mulberry trees. I actually have, I believe, both of these species in my property behind my house. The white mulberry is not native. It originally came from China. It was it was introduced in the colonies back in the 1700s when the British brought it over as a food source for silkworms because they wanted to try to start their own silk industry. So they brought it over here. It wasn't successful as a silk in the silk industry, but it did become invasive. And how can you tell these two trees apart? It's really not that easy to tell these apart. The white mulberry does have variable shaped leaves. As you can see in the picture, I have seen this on my own trees. Some of the leaves look very similar to the red mulberry in shape, and other leaves on the same plant will be lobed and have these notches in them. The leaves on the white mulberry are longer and shinier than the red mulberry. They have a heart-shaped base. The bark on a young mulberry tree can be a bright orange color. They bloom in April. Both of these trees have little green flowers that hang on little 1 or 2 inch catkins. The berries can be different though. On the white mulberry, the berries can be black, pink, or even white. So if you see a tree with white berries on it, for sure, that's a white mulberry. How this tree is harmful. It invades disturbed areas where the soil has been turned up. It displaces the native species. It will hybridize with the native red mulberry, and it can also transmit a root disease. The seeds, of course, in both of these are spread around and planted by birds when they eat the berries. How do you get rid of the tree? Pretty much the same way that we've gotten rid of the maple, the Norway maple, and the tree of heaven. Pull up any small seedlings that you see sprouting. Dig up any small trees that are larger than a seedling and make sure you get the roots. Cut down the large trees and grind the stump. You can also girdle these trees 3 feet from the ground. If you girdle them, do it in the spring when the sap is flowing to, cause them harm. And then if you cut them down, apply triclopyr or glyphosate to the cut stems and the trunk, just like Kathy described to you. Native replacements. Of course, we recommend the native red mulberry. On the red mulberry, you can identify it because the leaves are pretty much all look the same. They are not glossy and they have hairy undersides on the leaves. The fruit is kind of a purplish black color. And of course, the birds will eat both of them. I do know that they may sell a lot of hybrid types of trees in nurseries too, but the true native is the red maple here that you see, the Morus rubra.
Okay, so you've probably seen these calorie pears popping up all along, up and down Route 1. They spread like crazy. It's native to China and Vietnam. It was introduced here in 1909 as a rootstock for the common pear. And then later it was recognized as having lovely ornamental value. And it seemed to be a great tree for a street tree. And the most commonly known cultivar of the calorie pear is the Bradford pear. It will grow up to 50 feet tall, 30 feet wide. It forms these dense thickets that'll push out other plants. One single tree can spread rapidly by seed, forming a sizable patch within several years. It can produce huge amounts of seeds that are dispersed by birds. And the seeds this is part of what makes it so difficult to get rid of this tree, is the seeds can lie dormant for years in the soil, or they can germinate quite rapidly. And then the tree spreads. The flowering dogwood to your right is the Cornus florida, and it is not only beautiful, but it's a pollen and nectar producer, provides food for wintering birds. It grows to be about 30 feet tall and 30 feet wide. There are any number of beautiful spring flowering trees you could use. Like I love the various native dogwoods. There's also the redbud, Cercis canadensis, There's just a lot of lovely spring flowering trees to choose from. You do want to make sure if you're looking for dogwood that you ask for the native dogwood. Use the botanical name Cornus florida, because many nurseries sell the Japanese dogwoods, which are lovely, but they're not the native ones that our native birds and insects love so much. The flowers on the Callery pear, they show up in early spring, which is why people love them before anything else shows flowers. And the flowers they're white with 5 petals. They're about an inch apart, an inch across. The fruits mature in the fall. They're small, hard, brown, kind of woody. The flowers on the dogwood, the native dogwood, are a little later, come out a little later. They come out in April. The Japanese ones come out in May. And the flowers on the native dogwood are white and pink. They're actually bracts. They're like modified leaves. They're not even really flowers. The leaves on the Callery pear are deciduous. They fall off and they have sort of these purple hues in the fall. The dogwood also is deciduous, but it hangs on to its leaves, and they're red in the fall with these big red berries, and it's just a gorgeous tree in the fall. Controlling the Callery pear is very, 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 very difficult. The seeds, they lie dormant for a long time. They can be pulled when the soil is moist, and the medium to large trees should be cut down. Stumps should be treated with the glyphosate or the triclopyr. And that's what I got on the flowering trees.
Okay, let's talk roses. Multiflora rose. If you haven't seen this puppy growing around, we have some popping up also in the woods behind my house. This particular type of rose is not native. It came from Japan and Korea. It was brought here in 1866 for rootstock for rose cultivation. And in the 1930s, they promoted it for erosion control and as a living fence, because who wants to walk through a fence of thorns? The way you can identify it is native roses do not have white flowers. If it has white flowers, it is pretty certainly a multiflora rose if you see it growing in the woods. The flower clusters on the multiflora are only found at the ends of the branches. And how it's harmful. It displaces the native vegetation in open areas, and thickets can become impenetrable. Very, very lots of thorns, and you cannot pass through this stuff. If you want to get rid of it, it's not that easy to do either. Again, you can hand pull up the small plants wearing gloves and dig up the larger plants. And you can also try repeatedly mowing or cutting it back. That will control the spread. If you do cut it back and you see any berries, make sure you put those in bags and dispose of them, because the berries will reseed wherever they land. When you cut it back, if you want to use the chemicals, you can apply your glyphosate to the cut stems. Some great native replacements. There are a lot of different varieties of native roses popping up all over the North America. So I know there's some people here from other parts of the country. So I'm going to do you a favor today and tell you what kind of native roses you have in your area. So if you're in Delaware or the mid-Atlantic region, Virginia rose is pictured here, is a awesome native, beautiful plant with these pinkish purple blooms. Another possibility is the prairie rose, also known as the Arkansas rose. There is the meadow rose, which is also known as the early wild rose. And the cool thing about this one is that it is almost thornless. Another one that grows in our area is the swamp rose. And if you live a little bit farther north in the New England area, you can grow the shining rose or the prickly wild rose. That will also grow out west. If you live in the Rocky Mountains, you could try the prickly wild rose out there. And if you are in the Pacific Northwest, you have the Nootka rose. If you are in someplace where it's warm, like Southern California, or down in the Baja Peninsula area, you can grow the small leafed rose. And the native roses you can identify because they're pretty much either various shades of pink to purple in the color of their blooms.
Okay, Euonymus. That's a fun one to say. Euonymus. These do have the same genus. Burning bush. The burning bush came here from northeastern Asia in 1860 as an ornamental shrub because it's got this beautiful red color. The Euonymus on the right, the native one, which is also known as the American strawberry bush. These two pictures that I selected, they don't show these two looking particularly similar, but from far away they do look a little bit more similar. The burning bush is it outcompetes pretty much any plant. It can grow in just about any condition, doesn't matter what the soil is like. It'll grow in heavy shade. It'll grow in full sun. It is highly, highly invasive, and the birds love it and they eat it, and then they disperse the seeds to new places. So it spreads quite easily. It is deciduous. It's an upright shrub. The fruit on it, when it comes out, it's like a little capsule that's purplish. And the way you can tell, so if you think you have one of these in your backyard, if you look closely at the stems, and you'll see there's a little photograph inset there. The stems are winged. They've got these weird little cutout shapes. So they've got these stemmed kind of these winged kind of stems. The native Euonymus, I've added a few of these to my property, and they are just so much fun. The color, and it comes out in the fall. The colors are exactly like you see on the screen. It's bright, bright, hot pink, and then these orangish red berries. It's just a really fun plant, and the birds go nuts over it. It's very easy to identify the native Euonymus, the Euonymus americanus, or the American strawberry bush, because of these really unusual looking fruits. So how do you control the burning bush? Well, pretty much the same way we've been saying all along. You can pull them by hand. You can repeatedly cut them to the ground to control the resprouting, or you can cut them and quickly treat them with an herbicide like glyphosate. And once you've gotten rid of it, you want to try to replant. And this is true in a lot of cases with a lot of things. We get excited about just let's pull out that English ivy, let's pull out all this stuff. You want to have a replacement in mind, because if you just leave the bare soil, these things, those birds are going to figure out a way to get that thing planted there again. So replant with native vegetation to help prevent any further invasion of this stuff. Okay, Debbie.
Okay, let's talk honeysuckle. Other than wiregrass, this is pretty much my husband's arch enemy in yard work. When we moved into our property, there was a huge clump of Japanese honeysuckle, and to me it's like, oh, this smells so good. I love working in my garden and smelling the honeysuckle. And then I learned it's invasive. That quickly became apparent because it pretty much started covering everything in the woods back there. So the Japanese honeysuckle came from, it's not native, came from Japan, Korea, and Eastern China. It was brought to Long Island in 1806 and sold in nurseries where it was promoted as being beneficial to wildlife. You can identify the Japanese honeysuckle because the small stems will have a lot of hairs on them. They have little hairy stems, and they have white flowers that as they mature will turn yellow. How is it harmful? The vines form a sprawling, dense mat on the surface of the ground. They climb up everything. They'll climb up the stem of one of your native flowers if they're allowed to. They can climb even high up into the trees, and you can, when we pull it off, you can actually see where it has squeezed into the bark. There'll be like in a permanent spiral pattern on the trunks of the trees where it is attempted to strangle them before we rescued our tree. It can exclude all other vegetation and inhibit the forest regeneration and reduce the biodiversity. And as I've said, it will choke out your native trees and wildflowers. How to get rid of it? Wow, this has been an ongoing issue here for sure. Pull or dig the new shoots and seedlings. So I pull up handfuls of it. I go out there and pull up handfuls and handfuls of it at a time. We suspect that the main plant is actually on the property behind us. So if we could find where the main plant started, and that would probably be helpful because we could nip it at the bud. Otherwise, we keep cutting it down, cutting it back, pulling it up, remove all the parts of the plants. If it's past its blooming time and it's producing fruits, make sure that you bag those up so that they don't reroot, and cut the vines down at ground level. If you want to apply chemicals to this one, the thing about the honeysuckle is that the leaves stay green all winter. So if you wait till after the last frost, you can actually do a foliar application of glyphosate to the leaves of the honeysuckle plants, as long as you don't have any other plants with green leaves that are nearby. To replace, or if you want to just plant it, I highly recommend the coral honeysuckle. This is a native honeysuckle. It's also called a trumpet honeysuckle. So those names are used interchangeably for this particular variety of honeysuckle. Another type of native honeysuckle is called the twining honeysuckle. And the really cool thing about the twining honeysuckle, which is Lonicera dioica, it's a favorite nectar source for ruby-throated hummingbirds. So if you want to attract some of those hummingbirds, you can plant some twining honeysuckle.
All right, good old porcelainberry versus the native grape. So you've probably, I don't know if you guys have experienced with this, but we certainly have in our property. Porcelainberry is native to Japan and northern China, and like so many of these things, it was brought here as an ornamental. It can create this really cool screen if you're looking for some sort of screening, but don't use porcelainberry. And in our last property, I never was quite sure that whether I was dealing with porcelainberry or grapevines. And that's why I wanted to do this slide, because I really wanted to learn more about it. So they do look very similar, and they're both obnoxious, really. But the porcelainberry is invasive, which makes it way more obnoxious than the native grapevine. The vines on the porcelainberry, they form these dense mats. They'll climb over other vegetation. You'll see this along the highway also in some places where they've just completely smothered any tree that they've encircled themselves around, killing the tree because the tree can't get photosynthesis. The seeds get dispersed by birds, and this stuff can grow near water. It tends to be most invasive in places that have, areas that have been disturbed. You don't often find this in mature forests that are closed off. The canopy is, nice growth. The grapevines don't tend to get into the interior of, the porcelainberry does not tend to get into the interior of that. Well, how do you tell the difference? So the berries on the porcelainberry tend to be hard, whereas the ones on the native grape are squishy and watery. The berries on the porcelainberry they sort of look like Easter eggs. They've got all these pretty colors. They also smell a little bit like fresh corn. If you can squish them, they're hard, but if you can squish them, they smell a little bit like corn. The grape berries are green, black, or purple. They don't get these pretty pastel colors. I think the easiest identifier is to look at the clusters. The clusters of berries on the porcelainberry tend to or do point upwards, whereas the clusters on the grapevine, they droop. The bark on the porcelainberry, you cannot peel it, whereas the bark on the native grape, you can peel it. The pith, which is the interior of the stem, if you cut the stem in half, the pith in the porcelainberry is white, the pith in the grapevine is brown. The leaves, they look kind of similar, but the leaves on the porcelainberry, they do tend to be, they often have these deep lobes, whereas the native grape, the leaves tend to be more whole. They're not divided. They don't have these lobes in them. The native grapevine is, it's a wonderful summer food. It's eaten by something like 45 species of birds in our region. Box turtles love it. The vine can be tangly and can, cause damage to your trees. So you do want to keep an eye on it. The control for how to control the porcelainberry, if you've got youngish vines, you just pull them up by hand, right? Try to remove all the rootstock. You want to be careful when you're trying to pull them off branches, because you can pull so hard that you break your branches. So you want to be careful. And again, if you have to, you can apply an herbicide like glyphosate. You can apply it to the leaves, you can apply it to the stems. And I know that someone in the chat has asked a question about glyphosate that we will definitely answer at the end of the presentation. Glyphosate or any kind of chemical control is always last resort, and always by following the directions to a T. Okay, Debbie.
Okay, we're going to move on to a grass. Phragmites. If you have ever driven in the coastal areas of Delaware, where it's more of a wetland area, you have seen these as pretty much as far as you can see. So the invasive Phragmites came, it's called the European Phragmites, but it's actually originated in the Middle East, and it's now considered native to Europe. So it's been naturalized there. It got to the US, they believe, accidentally, coming over included, I guess, some of the seeds or parts of the plants in the ship ballast back in the late 1700s or early 1800s, and it spread and took over. You can identify it when it's in season. It has yellow-green nodes on the stems. If you were to tug on those sheaths, those seed heads, on the European, they don't come off easily, whereas in the native, they can easily be pulled off. So that's a good way to tell them apart. The leaves of the invasive one, when it's in season, are a blue-green color, and the natives are a yellow-green color. The invasive species is also grows much taller than the native. It can reach 15 feet in height, and the native only grows to about 7 feet. The invasive also has a longer growing season. And why is it so bad? It's highly, highly aggressive. It invades the wetlands and has displaced the native varieties, and it's actually expanded beyond the native variety's original habitat. It excludes all other wetland vegetation, and in doing so, it adversely affects the wildlife populations by getting rid of some of that biodiversity and becoming a monoculture. How do you get rid of it? Well, it's usually growing in water. So digging it up is kind of tricky when the roots are underwater. If it's not underwater, you can cut it, pull it. You can mow it in late July. Do that over several years it'll take to get rid of it. Remove any cut shoots so that they don't resprout. You can apply a glyphosate that's approved for aquatic use. Make sure that you can use it in water areas because we don't want to kill the wildlife that's living in the water. Do that in early fall, and then in late fall, the plants, when they're dead, you can burn them. So you can burn them and then repeat that whole process the following year. It takes a while to get rid of these things. If you do like grasses, don't plant the European Phragmites, but you can plant the American Phragmites. So if you see the Latin names there, the SPP, right now the American Phragmites is listed as a subspecies of the European Phragmites, but they are considering elevating it to a species level and calling it Phragmites americanus. The American variety is not invasive, and it can survive in the wetlands mixed in with other natural wetland vegetation.
All right, good old bamboo. So bamboo is a member of the grass family, comes from Southeast China. And believe it or not, it was introduced first in Alabama for fishing poles back in the 1880s. It grows and spreads rapidly, 3 to 5 feet per year, dense system of rhizomes underneath the soil, which prohibits the growth of any other species. It gives you some dense shade and leaf litter that prohibits the growth of other plant species. It's typically green, but it will turn yellow when exposed to sunlight, hence the name golden. And the stems are quite hard. The switch cane to your right, I think that might be what I've got on my property. I was sure it was the bad bamboo, but I have to look at it much more closely. The stems are very flexible. So that's one way to tell the difference between the native grass, that's the switch cane, and the golden bamboo. The height of the golden bamboo, it can reach up to 30 feet tall, whereas the switch cane only will get up to about 6 feet tall. And the switch cane is it's sort of a preferred nesting site for various songbirds. It's also the host plant for 5 species of uncommon specialist butterflies. Typically found in rural areas where there's been little disturbance, can also be found though in coastal plains and lower elevations. So maybe it's not what we've got in our house because we're not rural, we're not coastal, we're not lower elevation. Okay, I'm gonna have to do some more research on that. Anyway, the bamboo, you guys, you've probably seen it. People planted it like crazy for a little while there. It's so cool, but it's so bad. So you do what you do with the other things that we've talked about. You cut it down, you mow it over and over again to exhaust the rhizomes. If you want to keep it, you shouldn't. No judgment here. If you want to keep it, you want to install some kind of a really thick, deep barrier to keep those rhizomes from spreading. And it can be contained somewhat. But it's really hard to do. And last resort is you cut it down and you quickly paint it with the glyphosate. And again, we'll talk about that a little bit at the end. Okay, Debbie.
Okay, moving along to ground covers. This periwinkle, also known as vinca, usually a vinca minor is what you'll see being sold, is a recent addition, fairly recent addition to the invasive species list. Before I knew this was an invasive species, I planted this in my property in Maryland where I used to live because our backyard was completely shaded and no grass would grow, nothing could grow. And I discovered that this grew very well, which is why it became so popular. This is originally from Europe and it was brought here in the 1700s and sold as an ornamental, very popular for shady areas. It thrives in the shade. It has dark green glossy leaves and they can be variegated. There's a variety called variegated vinca. The flowers can be blue, white, or purple. They have 5 petals and they bloom in the spring. What's so bad about it is that it grows too well. It grows too fast. It outcompetes the native plants and the wildflowers. It displaces your native herbaceous and woody plant species by growing so quickly it covers all the ground and squeezes everything out. If you want to get rid of it, you can mow it. You have to be very careful because all those little pieces you mowed up can reroot if you don't remove them. So you can pull them. I've seen people say they start on a patch and they work from the outside in, just pulling it all up. Make sure you get all the roots and all the stems. If you want to use an herbicide on it, because of the leaves being so slick and glossy, you need to use an oil-based herbicide so it'll stick to the leaves. You want to spray them in the winter when nothing else is green. If you want to make your own oil-based, you can take the triclopyr and mix it with mineral oil and make a spray that you can spray on those leaves in the winter. It can take several seasons to eliminate it. A very beautiful native replacement, which I love, I do have a lot of this, is the creeping phlox. The creeping phlox is native. It does great in sunny areas, a little bit of part sun. Problem is not so great in the shade. It does come in a lot of different colors, purples, blues, pinks, whites. It is native to the eastern and central United States. If you need to plant something and it's not sunny enough, you can try another native plant, which is called partridgeberry. That does well in part shade or shade in the Eastern North America zones 4 to 8.
Okay, we're getting down to the end here. This is my last slide. Pachysandra. I have been guilty of planting lots of Pachysandra because it forms this wonderful ground cover, and allegedly one would not have to weed when one has all this ground cover. Although I did find I still had to weed. Japanese Pachysandra, you probably can guess where it comes from. Spreads very quickly, forms this dense ground cover. It's pretty. It's evergreen. It produces these small white fragrant flowers in the spring. It gets to be about a foot high, but it is invasive. It spreads very quickly. So a nice replacement is the native Pachysandra, Allegheny spurge, Pachysandra procumbens. It might not, those are pictures from my garden. I have both. So it's a little bit more speckled looking. It doesn't have the bright green foliage that the Japanese Pachysandra has. It's semi-evergreen, but it has these lovely white or pink blooms in March, April, and June that are fragrant. It reaches about 9 inches high. It also spreads the same way the Japanese Pachysandra does, but very slowly. So it's nice. I planted it and I'm waiting for it. I wish it would spread more quickly, but then I guess it would be called aggressive. So getting rid of the Japanese Pachysandra, it is very easy to pull this stuff out. You just pull it out by hand. But you really want to make sure you really get the roots out, because those little buggers can kind of sometimes stay in the soil. You can also, and we did this trying to get rid of it, cover it with sort of a thick black plastic. Isn't pretty, but it's very effective, and the heat will, the plastic will trap the heat. The plants will get no sunlight, and it does take a long time, between 3 and 12 months. But if you're trying to be chemical free And if for whatever reason you can't, just pull it out by hand, it does work. You can use controlled use of glyphosate, but really only when environmentally safe options aren't possible. You want to make sure it's a wind-free day. You do not want to use it near bodies of water. It will kill all the vegetation nearby. Okay, Debbie.
Okay, that finishes up our list of plants. I know there are a lot more, but we're gonna tell you where to find out about that in just a second. So as a summary, I wanted to just go through the common ways to remove these invasives. Try the easiest thing first. Go out there when the plants are small, when they're young, and pull them up, get all the roots. Easier to do when the soil is somewhat moist. So after rain, when it's a damp day, go out there and try to pull things out. Cut down the trees, girdle the trees, cut the roots below the ground. If you're having trouble, you can try using a tiller or a disc to cut the roots under the ground to kill the tree and then remove it. So that's another option. Burning, if you have a small infestation, you can burn that out with a flamethrower or a weed burning device. But if you have a large area, you don't want to start a forest fire. So call professionals or the professional firefighters to talk about a prescribed burn if you have a large area. And if all else fails, go for your herbicides, but always, always, always follow the manufacturer directions. Be safe. A lot of these things are harmful. They'll hurt your eyes, they'll hurt your skin, and they will hurt your native plants that are in the same area. Both of the ones we have mentioned are systemic. Both the glyphosate and the trichopyr are systemic, meaning they kill the whole plant all the way down to the roots. So you have to be careful. If you get it on a plant you don't want to kill, it'll kill that too.
So what we probably should have even said at the beginning, there is actually a bill. It is Senate Bill number 22. And by July 1st of this year, nurseries, big box stores are prohibited from selling any of these invasive plants anymore. It's kind of crazy that they've been allowed to sell them, but free market. So anyway, a lot of these you will no longer be able to purchase, which is a good thing. It's based off of the Delaware Invasive Species Council's suggestions, where they've got a long list of invasive plants that are not allowed to be sold. And then there's a watch list of plants that they're keeping an eye on, because sometimes it takes a while before something just becomes invasive. So there is a watch list, and if those are sold at a big box store or a nursery, this bill requires that they come with a label that identifies them as potentially invasive. So yay, Delaware, passing this law.
I know my friends in other states and in Canada are so jealous. They're like, I wish they would do that here. I wish they would do that here, because we have a big problem. So it's a good thing that Delaware is doing with this. And just another information, this is something that we often get asked. People tell us, I want native plants, but I don't know where to get them. So there is a Delaware Nursery and Landscape Association has a website that's listed down there. And I have broken these down by county in Delaware. Also on their website, they will include nurseries that are in neighboring states like Maryland, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania on their list. And also places where you can buy native plants online. A little disclaimer, if you download this document, you can go here and download the PDF of nurseries that sell them retail. And if you look at the bottom, it'll tell you that this list is from 2010. So it's not up to date, but since there's been a huge popularity in native plants recently, a lot more nurseries are starting to sell them. We have added Homestead Gardens to the list for Newcastle County, a little bit north of Smyrna, the new Homestead Gardens that wasn't here back in 2010. And also Clark Seeds up in little north of Dover also sells native plants. If you go to I've given you the link in your handouts. If you go to that, there's also provided email addresses and phone numbers if you want to call these places first and see if they're actually selling what you're looking for. So that's just some information that we're giving to help you out to find your native plants. And we used a lot of resources. I don't expect you to get them off of the slide, but they were, this same list was emailed to you with your Zoom link for registration. So if you want to go back and review any of this, feel free to go click on the links in that handout and explore some of the information there. And that is the end of our presentation. I'm sorry we went just a little bit over, but we are ready now to get out of this and look and address any questions you might have. So let me end that. And come back in person and say hi. Do we have questions, Kathy? Let me see if I can pull
Yeah, let's start with the glyphosate question.
Okay.
Judy said glyphosate in food is a toxin. Why would you use it in the garden? And I think Debbie is going to be right there with me when we say we typically do not use it. Now, I have used it on invasives. I have used it on porcelainberry, but glyphosate, it is controversial. Now the EPA, it was registered with the EPA back in 1974, and every 15 years it goes through a review, most recently in 2020. And what they say, and you got to read the fine print, there are no risks to human health when used in accordance with the current label. Now that's what the EPA says. There is an International Agency on Research for Cancer. They have suggested that glyphosate is carcinogenic. There was a huge lawsuit claiming that glyphosate causes non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Monsanto was the company creating Roundup, and it is my understanding, they settled the lawsuit, which doesn't mean either side won necessarily. So yeah, glyphosate is herbicides, pesticides, they're all controversial. And so the bottom line is absolutely taking the most care possible if you're going to use it. And, you know, that includes wearing a mask, that includes wearing gloves, that includes making sure it's not a windy day. Or it might be hiring experts who know how to use it properly. It is not something that you just go out there and, you know, spray. You have to really take good care. So it's a great question, Judy.
And I took my husband's Roundup away and hid it from him because, you know, he has a tendency to be a little reckless with spraying it, and that's a big problem. So I gave him, he said, well, can I just use it for the cracks, things that grow up in the cracks of the sidewalk, because I can't get them out. So what I handed him was a bottle of industrial strength vinegar. Vinegar quickly kills those plants, but it is not systemic. So if you use the vinegar, the strength, I believe it's 20, they make a 20% and a 30%. You definitely don't want to get it on your skin because it's an acid and it will burn you. The vinegar will kill the plant. I mean, it'll be dead the next day, and then you can try to pull it up easier and get it out of the cracks of the sidewalk, but it is not systemic. It does not kill all the roots. It only kills the parts of the plant that it touches.
Couple people wanted to know if we were going to talk about English ivy or bittersweet, and I will say I really don't know anything about bittersweet. English ivy has been the bane of my existence in the two places we have lived. I have been able to, however, mostly get rid of the English ivy by pulling it by hand. It's kind of fun, kind of just, you know, you just pull it out. I have not used glyphosate or any kind of chemicals on the English ivy, but I do know the thing about English ivy is, and this was a mistake I made in our last property, pulled out a huge bed of English ivy and then quickly replaced it with Japanese Pachysandra, which did a great job smothering any potential English ivy, but then I had a Japanese Pachysandra problem. So that's what I have to say about English ivy.